You grew up without the internet. You survived without a cell phone. You figured things out on your own. And honestly, you preferred it that way. If you were born between 1965 and 1980, you are Generation X. And psychologists have studied your generation closely because what shaped you is unlike anything that came before or after. Let's talk about who you really are. Generation X came of age during one of the most psychologically turbulent periods in modern history. Your childhood was marked by rising divorce rates, both parents working full-time, and a culture that hadn't yet invented the phrase helicopter parenting. You were called latchkey kids, children who came home to an empty house, let themselves in, and figured out dinner on their own. And here's what's fascinating about that. Rather than breaking you, it built something inside you that most generations never develop: radical self-reliance. Psychologists call this internal locus of control, the deep belief that you are responsible for your own outcomes. Studies consistently show that Gen X scores higher in this trait than both boomers and millennials. You don't wait to be rescued. You don't expect the system to save you. You just handle it, and you always have. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Growing up in that emotional independence didn't just make you resourceful, it made you skeptical. You watched institutions fail. You watched Watergate's aftermath. You watched the AIDS crisis be ignored by leadership. You watched corporations downsize your parents after decades of loyalty. And your brain learned something crucial. Don't trust blindly. Question everything. That skepticism isn't cynicism. That's intelligence shaped by experience. Psychologically, Gen X developed what researchers call a low-trust orientation toward authority. And it became one of your greatest strengths. You were the first generation to truly question the social contract. Work hard and you'll be rewarded. You saw through it early. The marketing and media that manipulated, you spotted it before anyone named it. You became fluent in irony, in subtext, in reading between the lines, and that emotional intelligence runs deep. Now let's talk about the cultural forces that literally rewired your psychology. You were teenagers and young adults during the rise of MTV, punk rock, grunge, and hip-hop. These weren't just music genres. They were psychological movements built on authenticity, rebellion, and refusing to perform happiness you didn't feel. Kurt Cobain wasn't just a rock star to you, he was a mirror. That cultural era gave Generation X permission to feel things honestly, to reject the glossy, performative optimism of the decades before. And yet, and this is the paradox that makes your generation so psychologically complex, you are also deeply pragmatic. You don't just wallow in disillusionment, you adapt. Research published in the Journal of Managerial Psychology found that Gen X workers are the most adaptable in the workforce, more than boomers and more than millennials. You've lived through the birth of the personal computer, the death of the fax machine, the rise of the internet, the collapse of the dot-com bubble, the 2008 financial crisis, and a global pandemic. Every single time, you recalibrated, quietly, effectively, without making it a personality. There's something else the research reveals about you, and it might surprise you. Despite being sandwiched between two of the loudest, most studied generations in history, Gen X reports among the highest levels of psychological resilience, not because life was easy, but because difficulty was your teacher from the very beginning. You also have a unique relationship with work-life balance, because you invented the modern version of it. You were the first generation to push back against the idea that your career defines your worth. You work hard, yes, but you work to live. You have interests outside the office. You have an identity that exists beyond your job title. Psychologists mark this as a significant cultural shift, and it started with you. Let's not skip over your relationship with nostalgia either, because it's psychologically fascinating. Generation X feels nostalgia differently than other generations. Yours is tinged with a bittersweet sharpness, a longing not just for simpler times, but for a version of the world that felt more real, slower, less curated. A world where you had to wait for things, for Saturday morning cartoons, for a song to play on the radio, for a letter to arrive. That waiting built patience. That patience built depth. In a world now addicted to instant gratification, your brain is actually wired differently. Neurologically, delayed reward processing, the ability to work towards something without needing immediate validation, is stronger in those who grew up without on-demand everything. That's you. And in the attention economy of today, That is a superpower most people are desperately trying to rebuild. Here's the truth that psychology keeps confirming about Generation X. You are the bridge generation. You remember the world before, and you function in the world after. You carry analog wisdom in a digital age. You have the skepticism to resist manipulation, the resilience to outlast setbacks, the independence to lead without needing applause, and the emotional depth to understand what actually matters. You were never the loudest generation in the room, but you were always the one who kept things from falling apart. And maybe, just maybe, the world could use a little more of that right now.